In the Second World War, a new generation of planes takes aerial combat to deadly new heights. Fighters designed to outmaneuver one another in the open sky. Dive bombers engineered to deliver devastation from above. Torpedo planes built to skim the waves and punch holes in the mightiest warships ever put to sea. And daredevil pilots, men who climbed into cockpits knowing the odds and flew anyway. This is the story of the machines and the men who flew them, of engineers who solved impossible problems under the pressure of wartime deadlines, of pilots who trusted those machines with their lives, and of a handful of aircraft that changed the course of history. The planes of the Second World War were not mere tools. They were extensions of the men who flew them, fragile, powerful, and unforgiving. Every innovation, every mechanical breakthrough, every modification made in a factory or a field hangar carried the weight of lives in the balance. A better engine meant a pilot came home. A stronger wing meant a bomber reached its target. A longer fuel tank meant the difference between victory and a watery grave in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. From the beaches of Normandy to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, from the frozen skies above Berlin to the vast blue waters of the Philippine Sea, these wings carried the war and the hopes of nations on their shoulders. The stories that follow are drawn from the men who were there, who climbed into those cockpits, who felt the engines roar beneath them, and who lived to remember what it meant. Some of them are still telling those stories, and every one of them begins the same way, with a young man looking up at the sky and deciding to fly. June 6, 1944. The rain-soaked beaches of northern France. Allied forces launch an audacious plan to liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. The D-Day invasion begins with an intense bombardment of the French coastline, and along 50 miles of heavily mined shoreline, more than 160,000 Allied troops struggle through a gauntlet of exploding artillery and machine gun fire from German strongholds. Above those beaches, fighter pilot Archie Maltby provides cover for the men below. A member of the 365th Fighter Group nicknamed the Hellhawks, Maltby took off just at dawn. By the time he reached the coast, the landings were already underway. Maltby saw something no amount of training could have prepared him for. You couldn't help but bleed a little bit for the guys that were down there. The water along the shoreline was already red around the edges. From the air, Maltby said, it looked like a mixture of hell. Maltby spent D-Day in his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, attacking Nazi planes in the air and bombing targets on the ground. The P-47 was a beast of an airplane nicknamed the Jug for its milk jug shape. It was designed to take on Germany's best fighters, including the deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109, a plane known for its superior climbing and diving and armed with a 20mm cannon that, as Maltby put it, was pretty effective. You didn't want to get lined up with that too well, he said, if you could help it. But the P-47 had to do more than dogfight. It also had to escort Allied bombers at high altitude, and that created a daunting technical challenge for engineers. At 20,000 feet or higher, the altitude of many bomber escort missions, the air contains about 10% less oxygen, decreasing its density. The P-47's induction system, which measures and directs the flow of air into the engine, becomes far less efficient in that thin air. As Maltby explained, airplanes are always faster and produce more horsepower at sea level rather than way up high. Engineers solved this problem with an innovative power booster called a turbo supercharger. Through a complex system of ducts, both the exhaust from the engine and outside air were channeled into a wheel-shaped turbo supercharger positioned behind the cockpit. Inside, the air was tightly compressed, boosting the percentage of oxygen before sending it to the engine. The end result was cool, compressed air at high-altitude performance that typically was not attainable, but now was, thanks to that turbo supercharger. With denser air pumping through its engine, the P-47 was now capable of high performance and maneuverability at both low and high altitude, making it an ideal patrol plane for the D-Day landings and more than a match for the German Bf-109. In the weeks after the Allied invasion of Normandy, Maltby and his P-47 faced a test from a group of Bf-109s. We just came off the run, Maltby remembered, and the top flight was being attacked by 109s, so I just turned into them, and I closed too quickly, and I fired, and this guy blew up right in front of me. It was amazing that the P-47 could actually turn just about as well as the Bf-109. For Maltby and the Hellhawks, the turbo supercharger transformed the P-47 into one of the deadliest combat planes of the Second World War, a demonstration of how technology and innovation would help the Allies during their push toward victory. And the feeling Maltby carried about the P-47 for the rest of his life was, in his own words, very simple. I owe my life to it. After D-Day, Allied forces were rapidly advancing against Nazi Germany from all sides. American and British bomber aircraft streaked through the skies, determined to decimate the remaining industries fueling Hitler's war machine. Many of these strategic bombing raids were escorted by a valiant group of African-American fighter pilots, men who quickly earned a reputation for fierce fighting in dangerous conditions and a tenacious defense of the bombers in fighter. Their care. William Holloman, one of those dedicated fighter pilots, put it plainly: our job in the 15th Air Force was to protect our bombers. We would protect them against enemy fighters. His fellow pilot, Robert Friend, was even more direct. The thing was, get those bombers home. I don't care what else. Holloman and Friend belonged to the 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Red Tails because of the distinctive red paint on the tails of their airplanes. That red paint served a practical purpose, as Friend explained. It meant the bomber crews didn't have to call and ask who was flying alongside them. They could look out the window and say, "Oh, that's the 332nd, because they're the Red Tails." The men of the 332nd were among the first African-American pilots admitted into the United States Armed Forces. Prior to their existence, there was a widespread belief that African-Americans were not capable of flying aircraft under combat conditions. At the time, many places and organizations in the United States, including the military, denied people of color the same rights and opportunities given to white people. Friend remembered that prejudice clearly. "I didn't like people telling me what I couldn't do," he said. "They didn't want me. They were going to accept me. We were determined." In June of 1941, the U.S. Army Air Corps began training black pilots at the new Tuskegee Army Airfield, a racially segregated military facility in Alabama. As Holloman recalled, when you signed in with the recruit, if you didn't say white, you went to Tuskegee. After their training, Holloman, Friend, and other airmen of the 332nd were eventually stationed in Italy at Ramitelli Airfield, a captured enemy base. And it was there that they picked up the assignment they would become best known for: bomber support. For the long bomber escort missions against Germany, the Allies needed a fighter plane with long-range capabilities, and there was one clear winner: the North American P-51 Mustang. It was a fighter plane with high power and maneuverability in combat, and critically, it could fly hundreds of miles farther than other Allied fighters. Holloman remembered those long missions. "The P-51 had much more range," he said. "We flew P-51 missions like 7 hours. The Allies needed the P-51S to go deep into Germany. And to accomplish this, engineers utilized an innovative external fuel tank that attached under the wings, nearly doubling the available fuel.
America, land of abundance, learns to mobilize its waste, to save its scrap, to provide more metals for war."
But wartime metal shortages forced engineers to think creatively. They built these drop tanks using a waterproof chemical compound of paper and glue. The glue-infused paper was shaped over forms, assembled, and coated with a fuel-resistant lacquer and aluminum paint, sturdy yet disposable. When the fuel was used up, pilots could drop the empty tanks, improving the plane's aerodynamics. These resourceful drop tanks allowed Holloman, Friend, and the other P-51 pilots to gain as many as 900 additional miles of flight, more than enough for their missions across Europe. The P-51, as historians would later affirm, was really the only American fighter that was able to fly with the U.S. bombers all the way to Berlin for the missions that hit at the very heart of Germany. The Red Tails bravely flew nearly 1,500 missions, most of them in the P-51. They protected bombers with such heroism and gallantry that they were awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, but even with such honors, they still faced social injustices in the military and at home. Friend reflected on that painful contradiction with characteristic resolve. "I think that in some ways, segregation, racism made us a stronger group," he said. "We realized we were trying to prove something, that we could do the job, and we were committed to that." Later known as the Tuskegee Airmen, these courageous African-American pilots broke down stereotypes and paved the way for racial integration in the United States military. Holloman's pride, decades later, remained undimmed. "Proud of myself being there," he said, "and proud of all the fellows that I served with." The story of the Red Tails is, in many ways, a story within a story, not only about the technology that carried them into battle, but about the barriers they broke on the ground. The P-51 Mustang gave them the range to fly deep into enemy territory. The paper drop tanks gave them the fuel to get there and back. But it was their own determination, their own refusal to accept what others said they could not do, that made them legends. The sky, it turned out, did not care about the color of a man's skin. It only cared whether he could fly, and the men of the 332nd could fly. The Allies' dominance in the skies forced Hitler into increasingly desperate measures. 3 months after the D-Day invasion, a massive explosion rocked West London. The blast killed 3 people, wounded 22, and left a 30-foot crater in the ground. The mystery explosion was initially thought to have been caused by a gas main leak, but people soon learned the truth. It was the result of a terrifying new weapon created by German scientists. It was called the V2 rocket, and it was nicknamed the Vengeance Weapon. Fired from hidden locations far from the front lines, the V2 had a range of 200 miles and stood almost 46 feet high, taller than a 3-story building. It was the first long-range guided missile in the world. Franz Stahl, a German artillery specialist assigned to prepare and fire the rockets, understood their significance. Germany in wartime had really advanced technology, he said. They were desperately looking for the thing that could turn the tide of the war. The V2 was a devastating weapon. It carried 2,200 pounds of explosives to its target, following a ballistic path until it crashed into the ground and detonated. Traveling at 4 times the speed of sound, the supersonic rocket approached in silence. Its victims never heard it coming, and when it landed, the massive explosion was powerful enough to obliterate an entire city block. But the story of the V2 carries one of the war's darkest chapters. The rockets were built underground through a top-secret Nazi program. To save costs on production, the Germans used slave labor. Over 6,000 political prisoners, prisoners of war, and Jews victims of Hitler's genocidal Holocaust were brought from the Buchenwald concentration camp. They were forced to work in and build the underground tunnels where the rockets were constructed. Thousands died from the brutal conditions, and in an effort to make the rockets less effective, the bravest of the prisoners attempted to sabotage them, even under the threat of execution. As a result, many of the rockets failed to launch, often with disastrous consequences for the German crews. Without the benefit of today's GPS-guided rocket technology, the V2 had to be carefully aimed on the ground toward the direction of its target. Once launched, an onboard guidance system helped maintain the rocket's trajectory during flight. This system consisted of 2 gyroscopes, freely moving rings and discs, that pivoted around an axis as the rocket moved. The main axis of the gyroscope disc remained stable. Data recorders measured the movement of the rocket's gyroscopes against their stable axis, which determined the rocket's position. This data was sent electronically to controls in the rocket's fins, which made slight corrections to elevation and direction, preventing the rocket from losing control and crashing. But the gyroscope was still primitive. As one expert explained, you could be relatively accurate. You could hit something like London, but you'd have a hard time hitting a specific block within London. Most of the rockets were fired from hidden locations and aimed at the cities of London and Antwerp, Belgium. They caused massive damage, inflicting heavy casualties on the civilian population. In London alone, the rockets claimed over 2,700 lives. By May of 1945, near the end of the war, the Nazis had launched over 3,000 Volts 2 rockets. The V2 proved successful as a terror weapon, but Germany was unable to stop the wave of Allied forces closing in from all sides. The rockets, built by slave labor in concentration camps, remain one of the darkest chapters of the war, a reminder that technological achievement, divorced from human conscience, can become an instrument of unspeakable cruelty. But even as the V2s rained down on London and Antwerp, the war's other great theater was reaching a climax of its own. Thousands of miles away, across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the United States Navy was about to engage the Imperial Japanese Fleet in a confrontation that would decide the fate of the entire war in the Pacific and test a different breed of aircraft in a very different kind of war. While the Allies pressed forward in Europe, the war in the Pacific raged with a fury all its own. Halfway around the world, from the skies over Germany, a different kind of air war was unfolding. One fought not over cities and farmland, but over endless stretches of open ocean where a pilot who went down had nothing beneath him but miles of cold, dark water. Allied forces fought to liberate the Philippine Islands from Japanese occupation. The United States Navy's Third Fleet patrolled the dangerous island waters to support the Allied troops and intercept the Imperial Japanese Navy. And the aircraft that would decide the outcome were unlike anything flying over Europe. On October 24th, An American reconnaissance plane spotted nearly 30 Japanese ships in the distance. The American aircraft carrier USS Intrepid received the order to attack the enemy armada. Navy pilot Ben St. John was one of the men who would carry out that attack. "We were waiting for the fleet to show itself," St. John recalled. "Every carrier, every ship had torpedoes, armor-piercing bombs set aside, reserved for the fleet." St. John flew a Grumman TBF Avenger, a rugged three-seat torpedo bomber with a powerful engine and folding wings. Torpedo bombers were designed to carry and release a 2,200-pound torpedo, a self-propelled missile packed with deadly explosives, deployed to sink enemy ships. Street. John had chosen this role deliberately. "I wanted to be a torpedo pilot," he said, "because I felt that's the place I could do the most damage." In his Avenger, St. John joined the third wave of aircraft that launched from the Intrepid to assault the Japanese fleet. As his plane neared the enemy ships, he saw something that stopped him cold, one of the largest warships ever put to sea. It was the Japanese super battleship Musashi, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. "It was obviously the biggest thing we'd ever seen," St. John remembered, "and with the most guns. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, more than we had ever seen. The Musashi was roughly a third larger than anything in the United States Navy's inventory." To make their attack on the Musashi, the Avenger torpedo bombers had to maintain a consistent speed and altitude, but this made them easy targets for the Japanese gunners. "If you stayed straight and level for any length of time," St. John explained, "they knew what you were doing. So it was the case of picking your spot, dropping the torpedo, and getting out of there." The weapon they carried, the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, was an engineering marvel with almost no margin for error. Unlike bombs that explode on impact, the torpedo was designed to fall through the air and then travel through water toward its target. It was dropped from an altitude of up to 2,000 feet and had to enter the water at an angle between 22 and 32 degrees. If the water entry angle was wrong, the torpedo could plunge too deep or skip off the surface, either damaging the weapon or throwing it off course. "In our mind, Street," John said, "we knew altitude and what speed we had to have to get that thing to go in at the proper angle. The torpedo's impact with the water tripped a valve, sending fuel to the motor that ran the attached propeller. Once it reached a preset depth and distance, the torpedo became armed to explode on contact with the ship's hull. The idea was to release the torpedo within 2,000 to 1,500 yards of the target," St. John explained, "and then turn away. If your aim was right, the torpedo would hit the target, penetrate the hull armor, and explode with devastating results." Waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers pummeled the Musashi with more than 30 bombs and Mark 13 torpedoes. The Musashi was, as St. John put it, pretty much out of order as a result of the attacks from the USS Intrepid. Eventually, the super battleship sank beneath the waves. As one historian noted, the Musashi's sailors had a song, the refrain of which went, "The Musashi is unsinkable. If Musashi sinks, Japan will sink with her." And that, of course, was precisely what happened. After 3 days of fighting in the waters around the Philippine Islands, the Allies succeeded in breaking Imperial Japan's command of the Pacific Ocean in one of the largest naval battles of modern times. St. John looked back on it with the quiet pride of a man who had done what he was trained to do. "I can look back on it now," he said, "and say that's exactly what I trained for, and to hope and pray that I managed to handle it properly." While the Americans fought their way across the Pacific, the air war over Europe was reaching its terrible crescendo. American and British bombers struck deep into the Nazi heartland with around-the-clock bombardment, and the Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the sky to stop them. For the German fighter pilots, every mission now felt like it could be the last. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outgunned. But they still had machines worth flying, and they still had the skill and the courage to fly them. Erich Brunout was a pilot in Jagdgeschwader 51, one of the most decorated fighter wings in the Luftwaffe. He flew the famed and much-feared Focke-Wulf FW-190, a sturdy and deadly fighter with a powerful 14-cylinder BMW radial engine. "It flies well," one expert assessed. "It's fast, it climbs well, and it performed well." All around, the Focke-Wulf 190 series was just an amazing aircraft. But as the war ground on, American airplanes became more advanced, flying higher, farther, and faster than the German FW-190A model. To keep ahead of the curve, German engineers replaced the radial engine with an inline V, 12 lighter, faster, and capable of producing far more horsepower. After A, B, and C models, this became the D model, nicknamed Dora. It was a powerhouse, with the speed and versatility to attack high-altitude bombers and their lethal fighter escorts. But the new engine brought a new problem. The longer nose added more weight toward the front of the aircraft, and that greatly affected the plane's weight and balance, a crucial aspect of aircraft engineering. The heavier nose moved the plane's center of gravity forward, the point where it was perfectly balanced in the air. This could cause the nose to point downward, making takeoffs and landings more dangerous. If the nose was not level during flight, airflow over the plane was disturbed, destabilizing the aircraft. To correct this imbalance, engineers were forced to make further adjustments. They essentially had to make the tail longer or put weight back there. They just took a plug, so to speak, another extra 18-inch section of fuselage, and they patched it right in and just made the fuselage a little bit longer. With the weight and balance corrected, the improved Dora became a formidable fighter. But as effective as it was, the Dora came too late. Germany was unable to mass-produce it quickly enough, and the sheer number of Allied aircraft overwhelmed the German defenses. Bruno flew missions in his Dora throughout the war. After flying over 560 missions, he reluctantly surrendered to Allied forces. The Dora's engineering advancements are still admired to this day, but they were not enough to turn the tide. Meanwhile, Germany's troops were falling back on both fronts. In a last-ditch effort to slow the Allied advance, German forces destroyed their own bridges over the Rhine River, creating a 700-mile-long natural barrier that brought the Allies' ground troops and supply convoys to a standstill. But American forces were able to locate and capture the last bridge left standing, the Ludendorff Bridge, in the town of Remagen. Hitler ordered the bridge at Remagen destroyed at all costs. German forces threw every weapon in their arsenal at it, including fighter planes. One of the pilots assigned to attack the bridge was Lieutenant Ernst Dieter Bernhard, flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the pride of the Luftwaffe. Since its introduction in 1937, the Bf 109 had fought in nearly every major German engagement of the war, from the invasion of Poland to the Battle of Britain to the assault on Russia. The Bf 109 was designed to be different from the start. It was a truly modern airplane, sleek, lightweight, all-metal construction that allowed it to slice through the air at high speeds. It boasted an enormous amount of firepower. In addition to its wing-mounted guns, it carried a 20-millimeter cannon built right through the center of the engine and propeller shaft. In German hands, it shot down more aircraft than any other fighter of the Second World War. One of the Bf 109's most innovative features was its body structure. Many airplanes at the time were built around a steel or wood frame for support, but the Bf 109 used what engineers called a monocoque structure. The monocoque design meant the weight and stress were carried by the shape, not by an internal frame. It worked like an egg, with the load carried by the exterior shell. By eliminating the need for interior support, the Bf 109 was lighter, faster, and more stable in the air. But like an egg, the monocoque structure was more fragile, and anti-aircraft fire could easily puncture it, leaving Bernhard vulnerable during his mission at the bridge. It was a trade-off that defined much of wartime engineering. Every advantage came with a risk, and every innovation created a new vulnerability. The pilot had to trust that the gains outweighed the dangers, and in the case of the Bf 109, more often than not, they did. Facing an intense artillery barrage from the Americans, Bernhard was unable to fly close enough to the bridge to score a direct hit. Days later, he encountered an even closer call when faced with an onslaught of American fighter planes. His aircraft was hit, and Bernhard was forced to bail out. He survived the parachute jump and landed back behind German lines. His mission failed, but he was grateful to make it out alive. The Allies' defense of the bridge at Remagen proved a huge success. American commanders would claim it as a crucial step during their final push toward Berlin and ultimately victory in Europe. By the final year of the war, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding pilots and planes faster than it could replace them. Fuel was running out. Factories were being bombed to rubble. And yet, in the midst of this collapse, German engineers produced something that would change aviation forever, a weapon so fast and so radical that Allied pilots who encountered it thought they were seeing things. William Holloman, who had spent the war escorting bombers in his P-51, remembered the moment vividly. "We were flying a mission one day," he said, "and all of a sudden, zoom, something came through our formation. What was that? Nobody knew what it was. What they had seen was the Messerschmitt Me, Mi-262 Schwalbe, the world's first jet-engine fighter aircraft. Previously, planes had been powered by piston engines with propellers. The Mi-262 had no propeller at all, creating an entirely different flying experience. First Lieutenant Jörg Sipionka, who flew with a special German unit of Mi-262s assigned to hunt down Allied aircraft on their night raids over Berlin, never forgot the sensation. The aircraft was easier to fly than any propeller aircraft because it has a nose wheel and it goes absolutely straight on takeoff. And there was no noise, no vibration, nothing. Fantastic. It was like being in a dream. Design work on the Mi-262 had started before the war, but several issues caused delays, and it was not ready for combat until late in the conflict. Still, Hitler and his Nazi commanders believed the Mi-262's state-of-the-art technology would help the Luftwaffe overpower the British and American air forces. Sipionka shared that confidence. "It was so innovative," he said. "It was a hit from the very beginning for me. I said this is the future." The Mi-262 was heavily armed with guns and rockets. It had swept wings and could climb to high altitudes quickly. At speeds of 550 miles per hour, it could fly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allies' fastest aircraft. What made this single-seat German fighter so revolutionary were the twin Jumo 004 turbojet engines. The Jumo engines, outside of a couple of flaws and the materials they were built from, are extremely similar, to this day, to modern jet engines. Like many aviation developments, the Mi-262's jet engines stemmed from a need to make aircraft faster and generate greater thrust. Thrust is the force that moves an aircraft forward, countering drag, the force that pushes back. The greater the thrust compared to drag, the faster the aircraft travels. The new jet engine generated thrust with a mixture of compressed air and fuel that was ignited. The burning gases blasted out through the back of the engine, thrusting the aircraft forward. The performance was just off the charts compared to all the propeller-driven airplanes. That superior speed required Sipionka and the other pilots to devise new methods for attacking the slower enemy bombers. The basic strategy of the Mi-262's combat was to come in from above high and fast. It would shoot as it went past, and the Allied pilots essentially had no chance to counter that. It was very suited in our capacity as a night fighter. Fast, heavy armament, go up, shoot, and come down. That's it. During one of his night flights, Sipionka encountered a British bomber, a de Havilland Mosquito, returning from a bombing raid over Berlin. "He came into my range," Sipionka remembered, "and I made a brief burst, only 3 rounds, and the Mosquito started burning on the engine on the right side. It was hit and fell down." The Mi-262 proved its worth in combat, but it came too late to alter Germany's path toward defeat. Bombing raids, material shortages, and production delays kept the Mi-262's short supply. Only a few hundred ever made it into combat, but the technology of the Mi-262 left a lasting legacy. As one aviation historian put it, the Mi-262 symbolizes advance in technology and aviation development at its finest. With the introduction of the Schwalbe, the jet engine was here to stay. It would influence further generations of jet aircraft and revolutionize aviation around the world. As the Third Reich crumbled, the last days of the war in Europe played out in scenes that were equal parts desperate and surreal. The full horror of war returned to Germany itself, as Allied forces advanced rapidly toward Berlin. German pilot Sergeant Wilhelm Zimmersohn felt the end approaching. Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor and leader of the Nazi Party, was dead, having committed suicide in an underground bunker just 3 days earlier. Knowing the war was lost and that they would likely face war crimes charges, high-ranking German officers scrambled to escape. At his assigned post in Austria, Zimmersohn received his final order of the war: fly undetected to a predetermined meeting point and help top Nazi commanders evade capture. He was hand-picked for the mission because of his experience piloting one of the most versatile non-combat airplanes in the German Air Force, the Fiesler Fi-156 Storch. The Storch, German for stork, was an aircraft of remarkable simplicity and ingenuity. What made it valuable for these types of missions was its ability to take off and land in very short distances, a capability known as short takeoff and landing, or STOL. This allowed the Storch to access areas that were much more difficult, if not impossible, for other airplanes that needed longer runways. As one expert explained, you can get in and out of extremely small places. You don't need an airport or even a runway. You just need a small meadow to get a Fiesler Storch in and out. The Storch's STOL capabilities were due, first and foremost, to its extremely lightweight construction. Engineers achieved this by making a lightweight airframe out of tubing, wood, and fabric. These lightweight qualities helped with something in aeronautics called loading factor, the ratio of the plane's lift to its weight. The Storch's long wings and light frame gave it a loading factor of just 10 pounds per square foot, only a fraction of other German planes, helping it maintain lift even at very low speeds. The Storch's unique abilities had been made famous in 1943, when one was used in a daring operation to rescue Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from a rugged mountaintop compound. That mission, carried out under seemingly impossible conditions on a rocky plateau high in the Apennine Mountains, demonstrated precisely what the little Storch could do: land where no other aircraft could, pick up a passenger, and disappear into the sky before anyone could react. The Storch had become the aircraft of choice for missions that required stealth, precision, and the ability to operate in spaces no larger than a farmer's field. For Zimmermann, those same STOL characteristics now allowed him to carry off his last mission of the war, taking off from a field in Austria to help Nazi officers escape. But Zimmermann was determined to save someone else too, and he brought on board a desperate stowaway, his wife. Zimmermann and his wife successfully landed at the designated meeting point in a small clearing, but further orders never arrived. The commanders he was supposed to extract never came. Zimmermann surrendered to the Allies as the war in Europe finally came to an end. His love of flying, the thing that had defined his life, was forever tainted by the harsh realities of war. In the Pacific, after years of destructive fighting, America was on the move and on the hunt for Japanese ships. Navy pilot Robert Turnell was part of a naval fleet called the Fast Carrier Task Force, stationed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp. It consisted of 5 task groups. There were 20 carriers in that task force, which is a lot of airplanes. Naval warfare had changed drastically since the start of the war. Instead of ship-to-ship combat fought mostly by battleships, opposing ships now might never even get close enough to see each other. Fighter planes launched from aircraft carriers, a revolutionary concept at the time, battled one another in the air and struck at targets below. The sky was filled with flaming tracers and shell fire. The aircraft carrier had transformed the ocean itself into a runway, and the pilots who flew from those pitching, heaving decks had to possess nerves of iron just to take off and land, let alone fight once they were airborne. The Fast Carrier Task Force further enhanced this strategy by grouping several carriers together into a flotilla. The Americans created a highly mobile, floating air base that could act as the main striking force against the Japanese military. Turnell estimated the force carried probably 1,600 or 1,700 aircraft. "All we did," he said, "was go up and down the Pacific and hit targets." But for this strategy to work, the Navy needed to control the skies, and its primary fighter plane, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was falling short. It was slower, heavier, and less nimble than its Japanese rival, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero's lightweight construction made it extraordinarily maneuverable, a superb dogfighting platform and a better fighter than the Wildcat. As Turnell recalled, the Wildcat was an aircraft that you had to be an athlete to learn how to fly, because all the controls were manual. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft took a hard look at the Wildcat's flaws and replaced it with an entirely new fighter plane, the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was designed with one purpose in mind: to defeat the Japanese Zero. Extensive technological and mechanical improvements were made, including automatically deploying landing gear where previously pilots had to crank it up and down by hand. The landing gear itself was also strengthened to better withstand hard landings on the pitching deck of a carrier. The cockpit was redesigned to sit higher, giving the pilot better visibility in combat and during carrier landings. And then there was the engine, a state-of-the-art Pratt & Whitney R2800, producing 2,000 horsepower. At about 70 miles per hour, faster than the Zero, the Hellcat held an enormous advantage. Its extreme speed, both in climb and in dive, gave it a decisive edge over the lightweight Japanese fighter. Turnell put it simply: the Hellcat was a much better fighter. It was bigger, had more speed. It was just a much better airplane. One more innovation set the Hellcat apart. To allow more planes to fit onto an aircraft carrier, Grumman co-founder Leroy Grumman implemented a concept called bio-inspired engineering. He looked to nature specifically, a bird folding its wings back to influence a new wing-folding system called the stow wing. The stow wings used a series of hinges to pivot and fold backward, tucking close to the Hellcat's fuselage. This bio-inspired design saved enough space to double the number of planes that could be packed onto a carrier. More planes, as the Navy understood, equaled a stronger defense. With these improvements, engineers succeeded in making the Hellcat the Navy's #1 fighter and its answer to the Zero. Turnell experienced that advantage firsthand during a dogfight. 8 Zeros in the air, he remembered, and each one that came down, there was an F-6F sitting there with the guns loaded and cocked and ready to go, and we shot down 8 of them. The Hellcat, with its numerous technological innovations, went on to become one of the most versatile fighter planes of the Second World War, helping the United States Navy assert air superiority across the Pacific and the Fast Carrier Task Force drive toward Allied victory. In total, Hellcat pilots would be credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than any other Allied naval fighter, a testament to the engineers at Grumman who had studied the Zero's strengths, identified the Wildcat's weaknesses, and built a machine purpose-designed to win. The war's end was in sight, but the last miles would be the most dangerous. After nearly 6 years of fighting, the Allies turned their attention to Japan itself. United States warships bombarded the tiny volcanic island of Iwo Jima as U.S. Marines advanced over the black volcanic beaches of this rocky Japanese stronghold. Combat erupted into one of the most violent and relentless struggles of the entire war. After 36 days of intense fighting, the Allies gained control of the island. The victory gave them a strategic airbase closer to Japan for attacks against its main islands. But there was a critical problem that technology alone could not easily solve. The B-29 bombers flying missions over Japan were suffering terrible casualties from the Japanese defenses and from the long, punishing flights of 16 or 17 hours with no fighter escort. U.S. Army Air Forces pilot Jerry Yellen was in the 78th Fighter Squadron, a unit assigned to escort those B-29s. He flew the North American P-51 Mustang, a sleek fighter plane with a powerful Packard Merlin engine and handling that Yellen described in almost poetic terms. That was the airplane of the day. There's no question about it. It's like flying a Gazelle, because the P-51 was very light on the stick and very responsive to what you were doing in maneuvers. The P-51 was capable of flying longer distances than other fighters, making it an ideal escort plane. But the missions to Japan and back were staggering 1,500 miles round trip over open ocean, without navigation equipment and with few landmarks to guide the pilots back to the 8-square-mile island of Iwo Jima. If they could not find it, they risked running out of fuel and disappearing into the vast Pacific. 8 square miles of land, one pilot observed, is really just a pinprick in the ocean. Navigation was critical, but P-51 pilots were a one-man crew with little time to look at maps. When you fly fighter planes, Yellen explained, you can't be looking in the cockpit. You have to be looking outside the cockpit. Navigating in a small fighter plane over miles and miles of empty ocean was, he said, a lonely and scary experience. Without GPS or radar technology available to them, the fighter pilots relied on an ingenious, low-tech solution, radio navigation. We couldn't navigate at all over water, Yellen recalled, but we did have a radio, and when we learned how to fly, we flew the beam. Flying the beam meant using radio range navigation to follow a moving target, typically a B-29 bomber. During missions, ground attacks, and dogfights, fighter pilots could fall behind the bomber formation. To help them find their way back, the B-29 navigators transmitted radio signals in Morse code, which were picked up by the straggling fighters. Yellen described the system. If you strayed to the right, you would hear Morse code for the letter U, he said. And then if you got to the other side of the beam, you might hear the letter D. If you were straight on the beam, you would hear just a solid tone in your earphones. Using this method, Yellen and his fellow pilots could pick up the sound of a B-29 from about 30 or 40 miles away, and that was how they navigated back over the ocean. This low-tech navigation system saved the lives of countless fighter pilots, allowing them to cross the daunting Pacific and land safely at their base on Iwo Jima. Yellen carried the memory with him for the rest of his life. The memory of every day, he said, and the pure purpose of every day that I fought for my country is permanently embedded in my memory.